There is a kind of silence that falls over a crowd right before something breaks a person in half. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of hundreds of people holding their breath, waiting to see how much pain one woman can carry before she finally collapses. That was the silence in the courtyard of Blackwood Castle on the night everything changed. Rain fell in heavy sheets, soaking through cloaks and hair and skin, but nobody in that courtyard moved to find shelter. Not one wolf turned away. They had all come to watch. Word had spread through the kingdom in hours, the way scandal always does, faster than truth, faster than kindness. The Alpha King was about to reject his mate, and she was carrying his child. Lydia stood in the center of that courtyard with her hands folded protectively over her stomach, rain running down her face so that no one could tell where the storm ended and her tears began. She did not kneel. She did not beg. Whatever they had expected from her, whatever story they had already written about the weak, nameless Omega who had somehow caught the attention of a king, she refused to perform it for them. Above her, on the stone steps of the castle, stood Adrian Blackwood, the Alpha King, a man who had once looked at her as if she were the only steady thing in a world built on power and suspicion. Beside him stood a woman with cold, satisfied eyes, a woman who had spent months waiting for this exact moment, though almost no one in that courtyard understood why. Adrian's voice, when it finally came, was not loud. It did not need to be. The whole courtyard had gone silent enough to hear a king breathe. Before the moon goddess, and before my kingdom, he said, I reject you as my mate. The words landed like something physical. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman gasped. Somewhere else, someone whispered a prayer. But Lydia did not flinch, not outwardly, though something inside her chest cracked so completely that she would spend years learning how to breathe around the sound of it. You're rejecting me, she said. It was not a question. She needed to hear the shape of the words in her own mouth to believe they were real. Yes, Adrian answered, and he could not look at her when he said it. Her voice dropped so low that only the wolves closest to her could hear it. I'm carrying your child. For one moment, something flickered across Adrian's face, something that looked almost like the man she had fallen in love with. Then it was gone, buried under the weight of everything he had convinced himself to believe. That child cannot inherit the Blackwood throne, he said. And why is that? Lydia asked. And there was a dangerous kind of calm in her voice now, the calm of someone who has already lost everything and has nothing left to protect except her own dignity. It was the royal counselor, Marcus Vale, who answered for his king, stepping forward with the practiced concern of a man who had rehearsed this moment for weeks. Because no one knows who your father is, he said. And there it was. The secret Lydia had spent her entire life running from, the empty space in her history that she had never been able to fill, had finally caught up to her in the worst possible place, at the worst possible time, in front of the worst possible audience. Take her out of the palace, Adrian said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word, though almost no one noticed except Lydia, who had spent years learning every sound this man could make. She held his gaze for one long moment. You will regret this, she told him, quietly, without anger, the way one might state a fact about the weather. Adrian said nothing. He simply looked away, and that silence was its own kind of answer. Lydia turned toward the gates. She did not run. She did not stumble. She walked, one careful step at a time, through a crowd of people who had once bowed to her and now would not meet her eyes. At the very edge of the courtyard, she stopped, and without turning back, she said one more thing, quiet enough that it barely rose above the sound of the rain. One day, Adrian, you will discover exactly who you rejected tonight. Then the gates opened, and she walked into the storm alone. Nobody followed her. Not the guards who had once protected her. not the servants who had once loved her, and not the father of the child she carried, the man who, in that very moment, believed he was protecting his kingdom from a threat he did not understand. What Adrian did not know, what nobody in that courtyard knew, was that far to the north, a rider was already moving through the mountains on an urgent errand, carrying a single sentence that would eventually turn his entire world upside down. We have found the daughter of King Lucian. Before we go any further into this story, let us pause and understand exactly who Lydia truly was, because nothing about her began the way anyone believed. She was not born an orphan. She was not born without power. And she was certainly not abandoned because the people who loved her did not care enough to keep her. Someone had spent 20 years making certain that Lydia never discovered where she came from. And the reason was simple, though it would take her most of her life to uncover it. Lydia's father was not an ordinary wolf, and he was not an ordinary alpha. He was a name that had been carefully erased from every history book in every kingdom. A name so powerful that kings who had never met him still feared the sound of it. A name that had vanished from the supernatural world exactly 20 years before that terrible night in the courtyard. Lucian Draven, the Dragon Wolf King. But there was a second secret hidden underneath the first one, and this one was far more dangerous. Adrian had not rejected Lydia simply because her father's identity was unknown. Someone inside his own palace had spent months carefully, patiently convincing him that Lydia was a threat. Someone had forged documents. Someone had whispered doubts into the ears of the council, one conversation at a time, until fear had grown roots too deep to pull out. Someone had been waiting with an almost unbearable patience for exactly the right moment to destroy her. And her pregnancy gave that person the perfect opportunity. Because the child Lydia carried was not an ordinary heir. He carried two ancient bloodlines fused into one small, fragile life. The Blackwood alpha blood on his father's side, and on his mother's, the blood of the Dragon Wolf King himself. So the real question in this story was never simply who Lydia's father was. The real question was this: who, exactly, was afraid of what that child might one day become? To understand the answer, we have to travel back to where this all began. Long before the crown, long before the betrayal, long before a king stood on the steps of his own castle and broke the heart of the one person who had ever loved him without wanting anything from him in return. We have to go back to the day a 5-year-old girl with no memory of her own name was found half frozen beside a river. 20 years before that courtyard, before the rain and the rejection and the sentence that would echo through 2 kingdoms, a little girl wandered alone through a dense forest. She could not have been older than 5. Her dress hung from her small frame in torn, filthy strips. Her feet, bare and bleeding, left faint prints in the melting snow. And around her neck, half hidden beneath the collar of her ruined dress, hung a small black pendant. She did not know her own name. She did not remember her mother's face. She could not have told you which direction led home, because in her mind, home no longer existed. All she carried with her was fire, the memory of a burning house, the sound of screaming that never quite left her, even years later, even in her quietest moments. And underneath all of it, a man's voice, desperate and breaking, shouting 3 words into the smoke and chaos. Run, little moon, and then nothing. Darkness and cold, and the long, aching silence of being utterly alone. The girl stumbled through the snow for what might have been hours, until her small legs finally gave out beneath her, and she collapsed beside a half-frozen river. It was there that an elderly healer named Mara found her, nearly too late, her lips already turning blue from the cold. Mara knelt beside the child in the snow. "Little one," she said softly, "can you hear me?" The girl's eyes opened, glassy and unfocused. "What is your name?" Mara asked gently. The child only stared at her. "I don't know," she finally whispered. "Your parents, then? Where are they?" The girl shook her head slowly, and something in that small, broken gesture told Mara everything she needed to know. This was not a child who had simply wandered too far from home. This was a child who had lost everything in a single night. Mara noticed the pendant then, half buried beneath the torn collar of the girl's dress. She lifted it gently and studied the symbol etched into the black metal, a silver crescent moon wrapped in 3 curved claws. It was a symbol Mara had seen only once before in her long life, and the memory of where she had seen it sent a small chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter air. She said nothing about it, not that night, and not for many nights after. Instead, she wrapped the girl in her own cloak and carried her home. "Until you remember who you are," Mara whispered to her that first night, "I will call you Lydia." And so Lydia grew up in a small village far from any palace, believing with her whole heart that she had no family left in the world. She learned to cook over an open fire. She learned to mend torn clothing with careful, patient stitches. She learned, most of all, how to survive without anyone's help, because there had never been anyone whose help she could rely on. She was not beautiful in the way that royal women were expected to be beautiful. She wore simple, practical clothing instead of silk. She had no servants, no title, and no family name to open doors for her. But Lydia possessed something that no amount of royal blood could manufacture. She possessed kindness, the deep, unglamorous, everyday kind that shows up in small moments rather than grand gestures. When another young Omega in the village fell ill, Lydia sat with her through the night, even when there was nothing useful she could do except be present. When an elderly wolf could not afford medicine for his failing joints, Lydia took on extra hours of work just to help cover the cost. When hungry children wandered too close to her small kitchen, she quietly set aside portions of her own meals for them and never once mentioned it to anyone. She never understood why the people around her sometimes looked at her differently, as though they sensed something in her that even she could not see. Not until the day she met Adrian. Adrian Blackwood had been raised, from the moment he could walk, to rule. By the time he turned 27, he was already regarded as one of the most feared and respected Alpha Kings in the Northern Territories. His father had died defending the kingdom's borders. His mother had died years before that, from an illness no healer could name. And Adrian had learned, far too early in life, that kings could not afford to be weak, and that love, in particular, was the kind of weakness that got people killed. He trusted almost no one. He had built walls around himself so carefully constructed that even his closest advisors rarely saw past them. Then, on an ordinary winter evening, he walked through a village market on his way to inspect the northern trade routes, and everything he believed about himself quietly began to unravel. He smelled her before he saw her. His wolf went utterly still inside him, every instinct sharpening at once, and a single word rose from somewhere ancient and undeniable inside his chest. "Mate." Adrian nearly stumbled in the middle of the crowded street. Across the market, a young woman stood arguing fiercely with a merchant twice her size, her chin lifted, entirely unbothered by his attempts to intimidate her. "You charge that widow twice the fair price," she was saying. "I watched you do it." The merchant sneered down at her. "And who exactly are you to question me?" Lydia crossed her arms and did not back down an inch. "Someone who knows how to count." Adrian felt something close to a smile tug at the corner of his mouth, an expression so rare on his face that the guards beside him exchanged a quick, startled glance. The merchant's attitude changed instantly when he noticed the Alpha King standing nearby, but Lydia had not yet noticed him at all. She only turned when the crowd around her fell suddenly, unnaturally quiet, and when her eyes finally met Adrian's, something passed between them that neither of them had words for. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Their wolves already understood exactly what this meeting meant. Adrian crossed the market toward her, and Lydia, recognizing him now, bowed immediately. "My king," she said. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lydia." "And your family?" She hesitated, just long enough for him to notice. "I don't have one." Adrian frowned. "Everyone has a family." "I don't," she said again, more quietly this time, and something in the sadness beneath those two words stayed with him long after he had left the village behind. From that day forward, Adrian found reason after reason to return. At first he told himself it was purely political, a king checking in on a small but important trading village. Then he told himself it was simple curiosity, nothing more. Eventually, he stopped bothering to lie to himself at all. He loved her, and somewhere along the way, without either of them fully noticing the moment it happened, Lydia had come to love him too. Adrian taught Lydia how to ride a horse properly, laughing at her stubborn refusal to admit when she was afraid. Lydia taught Adrian how to laugh at all, how to sit quietly in a forest clearing without needing to control anything happening around him. He brought her to the royal gardens, with their carefully manicured hedges and imported flowers. She brought him into the wild forest near her village, where nothing had been planted or arranged, and everything simply grew the way it wanted to. He bought her jewelry she never asked for. She told him every time that it was completely unnecessary. He offered her a private room inside the palace. She insisted on helping the palace servants with their work anyway, unable to sit idle while others worked around her. One quiet evening, watching her from across a candlelit room, Adrian finally asked the question that had been sitting in his chest for weeks. "Why is it that you never want anything?" Lydia smiled at him. "I want something." "What is it?" "A life where I don't have to be afraid anymore." Adrian took her hand in both of his. "You will never be afraid again," he told her. "I promise you that." Those words would return to haunt him more than once in the years that followed. Because when Lydia needed that particular promise the most, standing alone in a rain-soaked courtyard with hundreds of eyes on her and nothing but her own courage to hold her upright, Adrian would be the one who broke it. Not everyone in the palace welcomed Lydia. Some of the servants adored her for her warmth and her refusal to act as though she was better than them. Others watched her with quiet suspicion, uncertain of a woman with no family name who had somehow captured the heart of their king. The most dangerous of her critics was Adrian's chief counselor, a sharp-eyed, carefully spoken wolf named Marcus Vale. Marcus believed, with an almost religious certainty, that the future Luna of Blackwood should come from an established, powerful bloodline, someone whose family history could be traced back for generations, someone whose loyalty could be measured against the interests of a known family. An Omega with no recorded past, no family, and no history at all was, in his eyes, not simply unsuitable. She was a liability. An unknown Omega cannot sit beside the Alpha King, Marcus said to Adrian one evening, his tone carefully respectful even as his words carried an unmistakable edge. "She is my mate," Adrian answered simply, and there was no room for further discussion in his voice. Marcus bowed his head. "As you wish, your majesty." But behind that composed, obedient expression, something far less patient had already begun to take shape. Marcus started quietly investigating Lydia's past, pulling at every thread he could find, searching birth records, village registries, anything that might explain where she had come from. He found nothing. No birth records existed under her name. No family records could be traced. No history of any kind stretched back further than the day an elderly healer had carried a half-frozen child into a small village and given her a new name. For most people, that discovery would have been the end of the investigation. There was simply nothing left to find. For Marcus, it only deepened his determination. A person with no history at all was, to his mind, either hiding something enormous or had been deliberately hidden by someone else. And either possibility, in his view, was dangerous. Then, one evening at dinner, Lydia suddenly collapsed. Adrian caught her before she hit the floor and carried her immediately to the palace healer, his heart pounding with a fear he had never experienced in battle. The healer examined her carefully, then turned to Adrian with an expression that shifted within a single breath, from concern to something closer to joy. "Your Majesty," she said. "What is it? Tell me. Congratulations are in order." Adrian went completely still. "What do you mean?" The healer looked toward Lydia, who was slowly beginning to stir. "Your mate is carrying a child." For a long moment, Adrian could not speak at all. Then he knelt beside Lydia and took her hand in his. "We're going to have a child," he said, his voice breaking on the words. Lydia smiled through sudden tears. "Our child," she corrected softly. Adrian pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, and for exactly 1 week, everything in his life felt genuinely, uncomplicatedly perfect. Then Marcus came to him with a folder of documents and a carefully rehearsed expression of concern, and everything began, slowly and quietly, to fall apart. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, "we have a serious problem." Adrian frowned. "What kind of problem?" Marcus laid several aged, official-looking documents across the table between them. "We have uncovered records suggesting Lydia's bloodline may be connected to an enemy clan." Adrian's expression darkened as he studied the papers. "Which clan?" "The Draven bloodline," Marcus said quietly. Every wolf in every kingdom had heard that name at some point in their lives, even if only as a distant, half-forgotten legend. The Dravens had vanished from the known world 20 years earlier. In the silence that followed their disappearance, rumors had grown wild and strange, the way rumors always do when there is no one left to correct them. Marcus continued, watching Adrian's face carefully. "Your Majesty, if Lydia truly carries Draven blood, then what?" Adrian demanded. "Then the child she carries could inherit abilities that pose a direct threat to your throne." Adrian shook his head firmly. "You have no actual proof of any of this." Marcus lowered his voice to something almost gentle, almost reasonable. "Then investigate the matter carefully, Your Majesty, before it becomes too late to act." That single sentence planted a seed of doubt deep inside Adrian's chest, and doubt, once it takes root inside a king's mind, has a way of growing far faster than anyone expects. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked with quiet, methodical patience. He forged letters designed to look decades old. He fabricated records suggesting that Lydia's mother had once been closely involved with enemy wolves during a period of conflict long before Lydia was born. He even produced a paid witness willing to swear that Lydia's mother had taken part in an old rebellion against the northern kingdoms. Adrian confronted Lydia with all of it at once, his fear and confusion spilling out as anger. "Why didn't you ever tell me the truth about your mother?" he demanded. Lydia stared at him, genuinely bewildered. "I told you already. I don't remember her at all. You're lying to me." "Adrian, you knew your family was connected to the Dravens, and you said nothing." "I didn't know that. I don't know anything about my family. You know that better than anyone." "Then explain this," he said, throwing the forged documents onto the table between them. Lydia picked up the papers with trembling hands and read through them carefully. Then she set them back down and shook her head. "None of this is true. You expect me to simply believe that?" "Yes," she said, without a moment's hesitation. "Because I love you. For just a moment, Adrian's anger wavered, cracking under the weight of everything he actually knew about the woman standing in front of him. Lydia stepped closer and placed her hand gently over his heart. "I don't know who my father is," she said quietly, "but I know exactly who you are." Adrian closed his eyes, and for one fragile moment, he nearly let himself believe her completely. Then Marcus entered the room. "Your Majesty," he said, "the Council has just discovered another document." That single interruption was enough. The small seed of doubt Marcus had planted weeks earlier had already grown into something closer to fear, and fear, left unchecked in the heart of the king, has a way of curdling into cruelty. The royal council gathered soon after, and their demand was unanimous and immediate. Lydia needed to be removed from the palace before her pregnancy advanced any further. Adrian refused outright. It was Marcus who eventually delivered the argument that finally broke him. "If you allow this woman to give birth to an heir of unknown origin," Marcus said carefully, "you risk the very survival of this kingdom." Adrian looked around the room at the faces of his council, every one of them nodding in quiet agreement. "What exactly do you want from me?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "Reject her." Something in Adrian's chest seemed to collapse inward. "No, Your Majesty, please consider." I said no. But Marcus understood Adrian's deepest weakness better than almost anyone else in that room. He leaned in and spoke just quietly enough that only Adrian could hear him. "Think of your child," he said. "Think of what kind of world you would be handing him." That night, Adrian stood alone in the half-finished nursery, surrounded by the small, hopeful preparations he and Lydia had made together over the past weeks. He imagined his son growing up surrounded by enemies he could not name. He imagined a war he could not win. He imagined, in his most fearful moments, an entire kingdom burning because of a decision he had been too afraid to make in time. And in the end, he chose fear over trust. The next morning, he summoned Lydia to the courtyard, and everything that followed, the rain, the rejection, the broken promise, the long walk into the storm, began with that single, terrible choice. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would genuinely love to hear from you. And if you're new here, please click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's continue. Lydia walked for what felt like hours after leaving the castle behind her. She had nowhere in particular to go, no destination in mind, only the desperate need to keep moving forward, one step after another, before her body gave her any excuse to stop. The rain grew heavier with each passing hour, soaking through her clothes completely, and her advancing pregnancy made every step increasingly painful. Eventually, her legs simply refused to carry her any further, and she collapsed beneath the twisted roots of an ancient tree at the edge of the forest. She pressed both hands protectively over her stomach. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the darkness. "I couldn't protect you from him." Tears mixed freely with the rain running down her face. Then, somewhere close by, she heard a low, deliberate growl. Lydia looked up sharply. 6 wolves had emerged silently from the tree-line and now stood surrounding her in a wide, watchful circle. She tried to push herself upright despite her exhaustion. "Stay away from me," she warned, though her voice shook. The largest of the 6 wolves stepped forward. Instead of attacking, he shifted, and an elderly man with soaked silver hair stood before her instead. His eyes moved immediately to the pendant hanging around her neck, and every trace of color drained from his weathered face. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lydia touched the pendant instinctively. "My mother gave it to me. I don't remember when." The old man seemed to stop breathing entirely. "What was her name?" "I don't know," Lydia admitted. "I don't remember anything about her." He took a slow, careful step closer. "And your own name?" What is it? Lydia. Something shifted in the old man's expression, somewhere between disbelief and overwhelming relief. That isn't possible, he murmured. Who are you? Lydia asked. He sank slowly to one knee in front of her, an act of reverence that startled her far more than his sudden appearance had. My name is Rowan, he said. I served your father for many years. Lydia went absolutely still. My father. Rowan looked up at her, his eyes wet. King Lucian Draven. The entire world seemed to tilt sideways around her. My father is alive. Rowan's gaze dropped. No, he said quietly. He died protecting you. Lydia felt something inside her chest crack open completely. He wasn't the monster people believe him to have been. Lydia, Rowan continued gently. Then why did everyone hide him? Why did everyone pretend he never existed? Because every king in every kingdom feared him. Why would they fear him? Rowan met her eyes steadily. Because he was stronger than every single one of them combined. Rowan led Lydia to a hidden sanctuary carved deep into the northern mountains, its stone walls covered in ancient carvings that told a story she had never once heard. The carvings depicted an enormous silver and black wolf standing before hundreds of kneeling figures, a king surrounded by subjects who had chosen loyalty over fear. Your father, Rowan told her, was known as the Dragon Wolf King. Lydia shook her head slowly. That sounds like something out of an old legend. It was, Rowan agreed, until your father made it real. He explained patiently and carefully that the Dragon Wolf bloodline carried an ancient and exceptionally rare ability. Those born into it could command loyalty from wolves belonging to entirely different, often rival bloodlines. They could sense approaching danger long before it arrived. And once every few generations, a single heir would be born carrying the unique power to unite packs that had been at war with one another for centuries. Lydia stared at him, trying to absorb everything he was telling her. Why would my father have chosen to hide me, then, if all of that is true? Because there were people who wanted you dead the moment you were born. Her stomach tightened painfully. Who? Rowan hesitated for a long moment before answering. Someone from inside one of the royal kingdoms. We were never able to determine exactly who. Then Rowan's attention shifted, and he gently placed his hand over the curve of Lydia's stomach. His eyes widened in sudden understanding. The child, he said. What about him? Your son, Rowan said slowly, carries the very same blood. Lydia stared at him in disbelief. What does that actually mean for him? Rowan's expression turned serious, almost fearful. It means your son could grow to become one of the most powerful alphas born in an entire generation. Back within the walls of Blackwood Castle, Adrian found that sleep had become entirely impossible. Lydia's room remained exactly as she had left it, her clothing still hanging untouched in the wardrobe, her favorite worn book still resting on the small table beside the bed. He picked the book up carefully, and a folded note slipped from between its pages. Written across the front, in Lydia's familiar handwriting, were two simple words. For Adrian. He opened it with shaking hands. I hope that one day you understand that I never wanted your crown, the note read. I only ever wanted your heart. Adrian sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, and for the first time since his father's death many years earlier, he allowed himself to cry. A guard burst into the room moments later, breathless and pale. Your Majesty, what is it? We have a serious problem at the northern border. Adrian rose immediately. What kind of problem? The border has been breached. By whom? The guard swallowed hard before answering. Dragon wolves, Your Majesty. Adrian felt something cold settle deep in his chest. How many? Thousands. The dragon wolves who had crossed the northern border did not attack. They simply stood in perfectly still, silent formation, waiting. Eventually, A single messenger approached the castle alone, carrying a sealed letter marked with dark wax. Adrian broke the seal himself and read the single sentence written inside. "Return what belongs to us." "What exactly do they want from us?" Adrian demanded. The messenger's expression remained carefully neutral. "The daughter of Lucian Draven." Adrian went very still. "Lydia," he whispered. The messenger nodded once. "And the child she carries." Adrian's heart seemed to stop entirely in his chest. "No." The messenger studied him with something close to open contempt. "You rejected her, Your Majesty. You abandoned her while she carried your own child inside her. You no longer have any right to claim either of them." Then, without another word, the messenger turned and walked away, leaving Adrian standing frozen in the doorway, finally beginning to understand the full weight of what he had done. Marcus approached him not long after, his expression carefully composed. "We must begin preparing for war," he said. Adrian turned to face him slowly. "What do you actually know about Lydia's father?" Marcus hesitated for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "Nothing at all. Look at me when you say that." Marcus met his eyes, but his composure had already begun to slip. "You told me the Dravens were our enemies," Adrian said quietly. "They are. Then why haven't they attacked us already, if that's true? Why are they simply standing at the border, waiting?" Marcus said nothing. Adrian stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You knew," he said. "I don't understand what you're accusing me of. You knew exactly who Lydia was this entire time." Marcus's face remained outwardly calm, but his hands, clasped tightly in front of him, had begun to tremble, and Adrian noticed immediately. "Guards," Adrian called out. 2 guards entered the room at once. "Take Marcus into custody," Adrian ordered. In an instant, Marcus shifted into his wolf form and lunged at the nearest guard. Adrian fought him back with practiced precision, but Marcus managed to slip away through a hidden passage he had clearly prepared in advance, vanishing into the walls of the very palace he had spent months quietly manipulating. Adrian stood alone in the aftermath, finally understanding a truth that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The betrayal that had cost him everything had come from inside his own home. 3 months passed in the hidden sanctuary deep within the northern mountains. Lydia gave birth there, surrounded not by royal healers or palace comforts, but by Rowan and the small circle of dragon wolves who had sworn themselves to her protection. The child was a boy, with striking silver eyes that seemed far too old for his tiny face. The moment he let out his first cry, every wolf throughout the surrounding mountains lifted their heads and howled in unison, as though the mountains themselves recognized what had just been born. Rowan stared down at the infant in wonder. "The heir has finally arrived," he said quietly. Lydia held her son close, exhaustion and overwhelming love washing over her in equal measure. She named him Elias. But before she could fully absorb the moment, the heavy doors of the sanctuary exploded inward. Marcus stepped through the wreckage, his eyes fixed on Lydia and the child in her arms. Lydia rose immediately, positioning herself between Marcus and her newborn son. "You," she said. Marcus smiled coldly. "You finally understand who you truly are. You destroyed my entire life." "No," Marcus said. "I simply showed Adrian exactly what you were." Lydia's eyes narrowed. "You lied to him. You forged every piece of evidence." "Of course I did," Marcus admitted without a hint of shame. "Why? What could I have possibly done to you?" Marcus stepped further into the room. "Because your father destroyed my family." Lydia went cold. "What are you talking about? 20 years ago, your father defeated my father in battle and left our family with nothing. We lost our lands, our title, our standing among the other kingdoms. We lost everything. So this was revenge," Lydia said slowly. Marcus's smile widened. I wanted his entire bloodline to disappear from this world. Lydia held her son closer against her chest. And now, Marcus's eyes fell to the baby in her arms. Now I have his heir. Lydia's eyes flashed with a sudden, burning silver light. You will never lay a hand on my son. Marcus shifted into his wolf form immediately, and Lydia, without a second of hesitation, shifted into her own. The ancient stone sanctuary shook violently as the two wolves collided in the center of the room. Marcus was strong, trained for combat since childhood. But Lydia's blood, it turned out, carried something far older and far more powerful. She slammed him against the stone wall with enough force to crack the ancient carvings behind him. Marcus coughed blood onto the floor. You don't even understand how to properly use your own power, he snarled. Lydia stepped toward him slowly, deliberately. Perhaps not, she said, but I know exactly how to protect my child. She raised her hand, and every wolf still present in the sanctuary immediately dropped to one knee, an instinctive, undeniable response to the authority radiating from her. Marcus stared at her in genuine shock. What exactly are you? Lydia met his gaze without a trace of fear. The daughter of Lucian, she answered simply. At that exact moment, another howl echoed through the sanctuary from somewhere outside. Adrian had followed Marcus's trail all the way from the castle, and he now stood frozen in the shattered doorway, watching Lydia hold their newborn son in her arms. Something inside his chest broke completely. Lydia, he whispered. She turned to face him, her expression carefully guarded. Adrian's eyes moved to the child. Elias, he said softly, testing the name. She nodded once, saying nothing. Tears filled Adrian's eyes. He's beautiful. Lydia's expression remained cold. You shouldn't have come here. I know. I don't need you here. I know that too. Then why did you come? Adrian looked at her steadily. Because I finally discovered the truth about everything. Lydia waited silently for him to continue. Your father was never the threat everyone claimed he was, Adrian said. He turned his gaze toward Marcus, still lying against the cracked stone wall. He was protecting you this entire time. Marcus struggled to rise. Don't listen to him, he snarled. Adrian drew his sword. You lied to me for months. Marcus laughed weakly, blood staining his teeth. You rejected her because I told you to, and you didn't even hesitate. Adrian's expression hardened. I know exactly what I did. And now what? Marcus demanded. Adrian looked at Lydia, standing protectively over their newborn son. Now I know that I was a coward, he said quietly. Marcus, even wounded and cornered, managed a final, unsettling smile. You still don't understand the full truth. Adrian frowned. What are you talking about? Marcus's eyes moved to the infant in Lydia's arms. Lucian isn't actually dead. Every wolf in the room went completely still. Lydia's voice came out barely above a whisper. What did you just say? Marcus laughed, an unsettling, broken sound. He never died at all. Lydia's heart seemed to stop at her chest. Where's he, then? Marcus glanced toward the mountains outside the shattered doorway. He's been watching this entire time. A deep, resonant growl echoed from somewhere beyond the sanctuary walls, and the stone beneath their feet began to tremble. Then, filling the entire doorway, an enormous silver and black wolf appeared, larger than any wolf Lydia had ever seen in her life. The room fell into complete silence. The massive wolf shifted, and in his place stood a tall man with silver hair and eyes that mirrored Lydia's own exactly. She found that she could not breathe. Father, she whispered. The man looked at her with an expression of overwhelming tenderness. My little moon, he said softly. Lydia began crying instantly, all of her careful composure finally breaking apart at once. She crossed the room and ran into his arms, and Lucian caught her without hesitation. For 20 years, she had believed herself utterly alone in the world. Now her father stood in front of her, alive, solid, and real. Lucian explained everything to her that night, sitting close beside her while Elias slept peacefully in her arms. 20 years earlier, Marcus's father had attempted to assassinate the entire Draven royal family in a single coordinated attack. Lucian had defeated him in the battle that followed, but their enemies had spread false rumors afterward, claiming that Lucian himself had died in the fighting. To protect Lydia, Lucian had allowed the world to continue believing that lie. He had watched over her from a careful distance for her entire childhood. Every birthday, every difficult winter, every quiet moment of loneliness she had endured, believing herself abandoned. He had been there, unseen, the entire time, but he had never once approached her directly, because Marcus's family had continued hunting for any surviving trace of the Draven bloodline, and revealing himself would have put her life in immediate, unbearable danger. Lydia listened to all of it with tears streaming steadily down her face. "You watched me suffer," she said quietly, "and you did nothing." Lucian's eyes filled with tears of his own. "I know. You could have found me sooner. You could have told me the truth. I wanted him more than anything." "Then why didn't you?" "Because if they had known you were alive," Lucian said, his voice breaking, "they would have killed you before you ever had the chance to grow up." Lydia looked at him for a long moment. "Was it worth it, in the end?" Lucian shook his head slowly. "No," he admitted, "it was not." He reached out and gently touched her face. "I protected your life," he said, "but in doing so, I lost your entire childhood, and I will regret that for as long as I live." Lydia leaned into him and finally allowed herself to be held. For the first time in 20 years, she felt completely and without reservation, like someone's daughter. Lucian then turned his attention to Adrian, who stood quietly at the edge of the room, watching everything unfold. "You," Lucian said. Adrian bowed his head. "I know what I did. You rejected my daughter in front of your entire kingdom. Yes, you abandoned her while she carried your child inside her. Yes. Give me one reason why I should allow you to leave this sanctuary alive." Adrian met his gaze directly, without flinching. "You shouldn't," he said simply. Lydia looked up sharply at that, but said nothing. Lucian studied him carefully. "You are the Alpha King of Blackwood." "Not any longer," Adrian said. He reached up and removed his crown, setting it gently on the stone floor between them. "My crown means absolutely nothing if I was unable to protect the people I claim to love." Lydia watched him in stunned silence. Adrian looked at her directly. "I don't expect your forgiveness," he said. "I don't believe I've earned it, and I don't intend to ask for it." He took a slow step backward toward the shattered doorway. "I only wanted you to know, in person, that I am truly sorry for everything." Then he turned and walked away, leaving the sanctuary without another word. Lydia watched him go, her heart caught somewhere between anger and an ache she could not fully explain. Lucian watched her carefully. "Do you still love him?" Lydia did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but certain. "Yes," she said. Lucian nodded slowly. "Then the decision of what happens next belongs entirely to you." Adrian returned to Blackwood Castle completely alone. In the weeks that followed, he formally resigned from leading the council in any official capacity until a thorough investigation could be completed. He removed every one of Marcus's known supporters from positions of influence within the palace. He personally exposed every forged document Marcus had used to manipulate him, presenting the evidence openly to anyone who wished to examine it. And then he did something that no one in his kingdom had ever expected from him. He stood before the entire assembled kingdom and told them the complete, unfiltered truth. I rejected my mate, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd, because I allowed myself to believe that fear was the same thing as wisdom. The crowd listened in complete silence. I believed that bloodline mattered more than character, he continued. I was wrong about that, and I was wrong about her. He explained, in careful detail, exactly how Marcus had manipulated him over many months. But he refused, at every point, to use that manipulation as an excuse for his own choices. Marcus lied to me, he said, but I was the one who chose to believe him over the woman who had never once given me a reason to doubt her. That responsibility belongs entirely to me and to no one else. Months passed after that public confession. Adrian never once asked Lydia to return to the castle. Instead, he waited patiently and without complaint. He visited his son whenever Lydia allowed it, arriving without gifts, without demands, and without any expectation of forgiveness. He simply showed up consistently every single time he was permitted to. One rainy evening, Lydia found him standing quietly outside the mountain sanctuary, soaked completely through from the storm. She frowned at him. You could have sent a messenger ahead instead of walking here yourself in this weather. I could have, he agreed. Then why didn't you? Adrian offered her a small, tired smile. Because I want to see you in person. She studied him carefully for a long moment. You've been waiting for months now. Yes. And you still haven't asked me to come back to the castle. No. Why not? Because loving someone, Adrian said quietly, does not mean controlling the decisions they're allowed to make. Something in Lydia's expression softened slightly. Who taught you that? You did, Adrian said, even if it took me far too long to actually understand it. Lydia smiled at him then, the first genuine smile she had offered him since the night of the rejection. Adrian noticed immediately, but he made no move to close the distance between them. He simply waited. Eventually, it was Lydia who crossed that distance herself. You've changed, she said, studying his face. I had to. Do you still love me? She asked quietly. Every single day, he answered without hesitation. Even after everything that happened between us. Especially after everything that happened, he said. I understand now, more than I ever did before, exactly what I nearly lost. Lydia looked down at the space between them, then reached out and took his hand in hers. I can't simply forget what you did to me, she said. I don't want you to forget, Adrian answered. Why not? Because if forgetting means becoming careless again, the way I was before, I would rather carry the memory with me for the rest of my life. Tears filled Lydia's eyes. You really did learn something from all of this. Adrian smiled softly. I learned that trust isn't something a crown simply hands to you, he said. It's something you have to earn over and over again for as long as it takes. 1 year later, the Kingdom of Blackwood formally united with the Dragon Wolf territories to the north, forming an alliance that neither side had believed possible only a year earlier. Lydia took her place as Luna, though she firmly refused any title suggesting she ruled over the Dragon Wolves as a queen. Instead, she established an open council where wolves without titles or noble bloodlines could speak directly to the ruling family for the first time in generations. She opened shelters throughout the kingdom for omegas who had been abandoned or cast out by their own families. She helped pass new laws specifically protecting children born outside of recognized royal bloodlines from ever facing the kind of judgment she herself had endured. And she established one particular rule that would eventually become known throughout every neighboring kingdom. No child, ever again, would be judged for the secrets or the sins of their parents. Lucian remained close by in the years that followed, though he and Adrian did not become friends overnight. Trust, as Adrian had learned, could not be rushed. But slowly, gradually, a genuine respect began to grow between the two men. Adrian came to understand that Lucian was never truly his rival. He was simply the father of the woman Adrian loved, a father who had sacrificed everything to keep her alive. Elias grew up surrounded by both bloodlines, absorbing something valuable from each side of his family. He carried his mother's deep, quiet compassion. He carried his father's hard-won strength. And he carried his grandfather's unwavering courage, a courage that had allowed Lucian to endure 20 years of separation from his own daughter rather than risk her life. Marcus was eventually captured and brought before Lydia to answer for everything he had done. He was imprisoned in a remote fortress far from any kingdom, stripped of every title and privilege he had once held. When Lydia came to visit his cell, he laughed bitterly at the sight of her. "You won," he said. She looked at him steadily. "No," she answered. He frowned in confusion. "You lost, then?" Lydia shook her head slowly. "I didn't win because I became powerful," she told him. "I won because you failed to make me hate myself, no matter how hard you tried." Marcus stared at her, something like genuine bitterness flashing across his face. "You took everything away from me." "No," Lydia said calmly. "I took nothing from you at all. You took my childhood," he insisted. "The moment your father defeated mine." "And yet I survived mine," she answered. "You took my entire family. But I found mine again, in the end. You turned Adrian against me." He simply learned the truth for himself. Marcus fell silent, unable to find a response. Lydia continued, her voice steady and calm. "You spent 20 years of your life trying to destroy someone else's family," she said. "I spent that same 20 years quietly trying to find mine." She turned toward the cell door. "That," she said, "is the real difference between us." Marcus called after her weakly. "What difference is that?" Lydia paused at the doorway and looked back at him one final time. "You let your pain turn into hatred," she said. "I let mine turn into purpose." Then she walked away and did not look back again. Years later, Lydia stood on the castle balcony beside her son, now old enough to understand the full story of how his parents had come together, fallen apart, and eventually found their way back to one another. "Mother," Elias asked quietly, "is it true that father rejected you before I was even born?" Lydia smiled gently. "Yes," she said. "It's true." "Why did he do it?" She looked out toward the garden below, where Adrian stood speaking quietly with Lucian. "Because he was afraid," she said. "Afraid of you?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "He was afraid of what he didn't yet understand." Elias thought about that for a long moment. "Did you forgive him in the end?" "Eventually," Lydia said. "Why?" She took her son's hand gently in hers. "Because forgiveness never meant pretending that he hadn't hurt me," she explained. "It simply meant refusing to let his mistake control the rest of my life." Elias nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "Would you have done anything differently, looking back on it all?" Lydia looked out toward the horizon for a long moment before answering. "Yes," she said finally. "What would you change?" "I would never again beg anyone to recognize my worth," she said. "The people who truly value you will never need convincing." She pressed a gentle kiss to her son's forehead. Adrian joined them on the balcony a moment later. "May I join you both?" he asked. Elias smiled up at him. "Of course, father." Adrian wrapped his arm gently around Lydia, and she leaned her head against his shoulder without hesitation. For a long moment, the three of them simply stood together in comfortable silence. Then Adrian spoke quietly. "Do you remember what you told me that night in the courtyard, right before you walked away?" Lydia smiled. "Which part are you referring to?" "You told me I would regret it." She laughed softly at the memory. "I was right about that, wasn't I?" "You were," Adrian admitted, smiling. He pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "But there's something else I regret beyond that night alone." "What is it?" "That I ever allowed you to believe, even for a single moment, that you were completely alone in this world. Lydia looked up at him gently. You can't change what already happened. I know that, but you can choose to honor it going forward. Adrian nodded slowly. And I intend to, he said, for as long as I live. Sometimes, betrayal does not reveal the weakness of the person being betrayed. It reveals, far more clearly, the weakness of the person doing the betraying. Adrian believed that Lydia's unknown bloodline made her inherently dangerous. He believed that wearing a crown gave him the wisdom to judge her fairly. He believed, in the end, that rejecting her would somehow protect the kingdom he loved. But he eventually learned one of the hardest lessons a person can learn in an entire lifetime. You can lose something truly precious the moment you judge it before ever taking the time to understand it. Lydia spent most of her life believing she had no family at all in this world. And yet, all along, she was the daughter of a king. She believed for years that she had simply been abandoned by everyone who mattered. But in truth, her father had sacrificed nearly everything he had to keep her alive. She believed, in her darkest moment, that Adrian's rejection had permanently destroyed her future. But that same painful rejection eventually led her directly to the truth of who she really was. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson buried inside this entire story. Sometimes the door that slams shut in your face is not actually the end of your journey at all. Sometimes it is simply the door that finally forces you to discover an entire world you never even knew existed. And sometimes the person who rejects you is not truly rejecting your worth at all. They are only revealing, in that very moment, their own inability to recognize it. So never allow another person's fear to become the foundation of your own identity. Never beg anyone to see clearly what they have already chosen to ignore. And never, under any circumstances, believe that losing someone else means you have somehow lost yourself in the process. Because your value existed long before anyone chose to love you. Your value remained fully intact after they walked away. And your value will still be standing, patient and unshaken, on the day they finally realize exactly what they gave up. And now, we would love to hear from you directly. If you were in Lydia's position, standing alone in that rain-soaked courtyard, would you have eventually found a way to forgive Adrian? Would you have given your mate a second chance after he rejected you publicly while you were carrying his own child? Or would you have walked away from him forever and never once looked back? And what do you personally think about Lucian's decision to hide his identity from his own daughter for 20 long years? Was he genuinely protecting her the only way he knew how? Or did his silence cause her far more unnecessary pain than it prevented? Tell us honestly what you would have done down in the comments below. And if this story managed to touch something in you tonight, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for many more emotional werewolf romances, stories of Alpha Kings and the mistakes that cost them everything, mysterious hidden bloodlines, unexpected twists, and stories about the very people everyone underestimates, who eventually turn out to be the ones nobody can ever truly defeat. Because sometimes, the person you carelessly reject today may become the exact person you spend the rest of your life wishing you had never lost. And if Lydia's story managed to move you tonight, wait until you hear what happens in our next story, when another Alpha King discovers, far too late, that the woman he once abandoned has secretly been raising the very heir he believed had died years earlier. Until then, always remember this one simple truth. Never measure another person's worth by what little you happen to know about their past. Because sometimes the greatest secret a person carries isn't where they came from at all. It's who they were always destined to become.